I took the job at Midnight Oasis gas station because, honestly, I was desperate. You know that feeling when everything in life seems to be spiraling out of control, and you're just looking for something, anything, to keep your head above water? That was me. Rent was overdue, bills were stacking up, and my day job wasn't cutting it anymore. When I saw the "Help Wanted" sign at the gas station, I figured, why not? Easy money, right? Just watch over a gas station in the middle of nowhere, barely any customers, and plenty of time to myself. I could catch up on shows, maybe do some reading. How wrong I was. Midnight Oasis wasn't your run-of-the-mill gas station. It stood on the outskirts of town, miles away from any houses or businesses, shrouded by dense woods on one side and a stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever. The place had an old, forgotten look to it, like it had been stuck in a time loop from the late 80s. Faded, peeling signs hung above the entrance, advertising long-defunct cigarette brands and soft drinks no one bought anymore. But it was the job I needed, so I walked in that afternoon, hoping for a quick interview and an easy paycheck. I was greeted by Mr. Langford, the station's manager. He was a man of few words, with a gaunt face and deep-set, tired eyes that seemed to have seen things I couldn't even begin to imagine. He didn't ask many questions, didn't even seem that interested in whether I had experience or not. What he did care about, though, were the rules. "Here, you're gonna need this," he said, handing me a laminated sheet of paper. His hands shook slightly as he passed it over. I noticed then just how old and worn he looked, like the weight of something far heavier than managing a gas station had been pressing down on him for years. I glanced at the sheet, expecting standard instructions about cash registers, inventory, and closing times. Instead, I found a list of bizarre, almost unsettling rules. 1. Always greet customers with a smile, even if they don't respond. 2. The doors between midnight and 4 a.m. must remain unlocked, no matter what. 3. If a man in a black coat asks for matches, give him a single pack. Do not speak to him. 4. If you hear footsteps on the roof between 2 and 3 a.m., ignore them. 5. Never go into the storage room after 1 a.m. 6. If the radio turns on by itself, leave the building immediately. Stand outside for exactly 5 minutes, then return. I read the list again, my eyes lingering on each rule. What is this? Mr. Langford didn't even blink. Follow the rules, and you'll be fine. I almost laughed, assuming it was some sort of initiation prank. But the way he stared at me, serious and unwavering, made my stomach turn. I wanted to ask more questions, to press him for details, but something told me not to. Instead, I nodded, pocketed the sheet, and agreed to start that night. The first night started off uneventfully enough. The gas station was exactly what you'd expect from a place that had been forgotten by the world: dim lights, a few flickering fluorescent bulbs, and a cash register that looked like it hadn't been upgraded since the Reagan administration. Midnight rolled around without any customers, and I started to think that maybe this gig would be easy after all. But then, at exactly 12:10 a.m., the door chime rang. I looked up from my phone and saw him, the man in the black coat. He stood in the doorway, half his face obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. The coat hung on him like a shroud, long and heavy, even though it was the middle of summer. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting brief, eerie shadows across his face. "Matches," he said, his voice low and mechanical, like the sound of gravel grinding together. My hand immediately went to the drawer under the counter, where the matches were kept. I pulled out a single pack and slid it across the counter without saying a word. The rule echoed in my head: do not speak to him. He didn't move for a long moment, just stood there, watching me. I couldn't make out his eyes under the brim of his hat, but I felt them, boring into me, cold and unblinking. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. Then, just as silently as he had arrived, he took the matches, turned, and walked out the door. No, thank you, no parting words. The door shut softly behind him, and I exhaled, my hands trembling as I shoved them into my pockets. Hours passed, and the uneasy feeling left by the man in the black coat began to fade. But then, at around 2:05 a.m., I heard it, the distinct sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from directly above me on the roof. My blood ran cold. Ignore any noises coming from the roof between 2 and 3 a.m. I tried to focus on my phone, on anything other than the sound of heavy boots dragging across the roof. But the pacing continued, steady and relentless, like someone was walking back and forth, just waiting for me to look up or react. My muscles tensed, every instinct screaming at me to investigate. But I remembered the rule: ignore the footsteps. For nearly an hour, the footsteps continued. And then, just as the clock struck 3 a.m., they stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, it was suffocating. I took a deep breath and convinced myself that it was over. That was until the radio crackled to life on its own. The old-fashioned radio, the one that sat behind the counter, hadn't worked in years. But now, it hummed softly, like it was trying to find a signal. My stomach dropped as I remembered the next rule: if the radio turns on by itself, leave the building immediately. Wait outside for exactly 5 minutes. Without hesitation, I bolted out the door. The night air was still and cool, but it did little to calm my nerves. I stood there, counting the seconds, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. The station was quiet, too quiet. Exactly 5 minutes later, I returned inside. The radio was off, the store was still, and the footsteps hadn't returned. For the rest of the night, I sat behind the counter, staring at the clock, just waiting for my shift to end. Night after night, the same eerie events repeated. The man in the black coat came in, always asking for matches. The footsteps would pace the roof, heavy and menacing. And sometimes, just sometimes, the radio would turn on by itself. But the worst came during my fourth shift. It was 1:30 a.m. when I heard something new, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the back of the store. At first, I thought it might be a customer, but when I glanced at the security cameras, the store was empty. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like something, or someone, was trying to get my attention. I knew the source. The storage room. Do not, under any circumstances, go into the storage room after 1 a.m. I tried to ignore it, but the tapping continued, louder now, almost frantic. It echoed through the store, sending chills down my spine. I grabbed a flashlight and turned toward the back hallway, even though every fiber of my being screamed at me not to. As I got closer to the storage room, the air around me grew colder. The smell of something damp and rotting filled the air, thick and suffocating. I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the storage room door. It was slightly ajar, just like before. The tapping had stopped, but now there was a low, barely audible whisper coming from the other side. It was saying my name. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear, but eventually, I snapped out of it and backed away, heart pounding. I didn't care about the rules anymore, I needed to get out of there. As I turned to run, the lights in the gas station flickered violently, plunging the store into darkness for just a moment. When the lights came back on, I saw something, or someone, standing near the counter. It was the man in the black coat. Only this time, he wasn't asking for matches. He stood there, motionless, facing the counter, his back turned to me. But I could feel his presence, cold and suffocating, filling the entire store. I swallowed hard, slowly backing away toward the door, trying to make as little noise as possible. Then, without warning, he turned his head toward me. Just his head. His body remained perfectly still, but his neck twisted in an unnatural, impossible angle, until his face, what little I could see beneath the brim of his hat, was looking directly at me. His eyes were hollow. I bolted for the door, not caring about leaving my post or whatever consequences might come from breaking the rules. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, speeding away from Midnight Oasis as fast as I could. That was my last night at the gas station. I never went back. Mr. Langford called me a few times, asking where I was, why I hadn't shown up for my shift. But I ignored him. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I answered, I'd somehow be pulled back into that nightmare. It's been a few weeks since I worked at the gas station, but I still have trouble sleeping. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I hear faint footsteps on the roof. And I pray they never come inside. I never thought I'd feel relief after quitting a job, but quitting Midnight Oasis was like lifting a weight off my chest. Yet, even though I was miles away from the station, something still felt wrong. I started to notice strange things happening around me, small things at first. My phone would ring late at night, but there'd be no one on the other end, just static. Lights in my apartment would flicker occasionally, not unlike the ones back at the station. It was almost like the place hadn't fully let me go. One evening, a week after I left the job, I was sitting in my apartment trying to focus on anything but the memories of Midnight Oasis. I was doing everything I could to convince myself that it was all just my imagination. But the more I tried to push it away, the stronger the pull became, like the gas station still had some kind of grip on me. Around 11:30 p.m., the strange tapping sound began. This time, it wasn't coming from the gas station storage room, it was coming from my window. At first, I thought it might be a tree branch swaying in the wind, but as I pulled back the curtain, I froze. There, outside my second-story apartment window, was a figure standing in the dark alley below. He was wearing a long black coat. The same black coat. My heart dropped into my stomach. There was no way. I had left the gas station, hadn't I? I hadn't broken any of the rules, at least not intentionally. I stood there, watching the man in the coat. His face was hidden in shadow, just like it always was. I expected him to walk away, like he had at the station. But this time, he didn't. He stood completely still, staring up at me. I backed away from the window, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. My mind was racing, searching for any explanation other than the one that was becoming all too clear. Whatever it was that haunted Midnight Oasis, it had followed me home. The tapping continued. I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just at the window anymore, it was coming from all around the apartment. From the walls. The ceiling. And worst of all, from the front door. A steady, rhythmic tapping, as though someone, or something, was trying to get inside. I did what anyone would have done, I grabbed my phone and called the police. But as I tried to explain the situation, my phone suddenly cut off, leaving me with nothing but that familiar, low static. My heart raced. I was completely alone. I stood there, staring at the front door, which had started to rattle as if someone was turning the handle, slowly, deliberately. My mind was screaming at me to get out, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. And then, just like that, everything stopped. The tapping, the rattling, it all ceased at once. The silence that followed was heavy, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I took a few shaky steps forward, cautiously approaching the door. That's when I saw it, a single pack of matches sitting on the floor, just inside the front door, as if someone had slid it under. The same kind of matches I had given to the men at the gas station. I dropped the phone. My pulse pounded in my ears as I bent down and picked up the matches. There was no mistake, they were the exact same ones. My fingers trembled as I turned them over, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw what was scrawled on the back, in what looked like smeared charcoal, "Come back." I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak in the apartment, every distant noise sent me into a panic. I kept staring at the matches, over and over, as if expecting them to somehow disappear. I thought about calling Mr. Langford, demanding answers, but what would I even say? He'd told me to follow the rules, and for the most part, I had. So why was this happening? The next day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I drove back out to the gas station, hoping to find Mr. Langford, to demand some kind of explanation. When I pulled up to Midnight Oasis, the place looked just as it had before, dilapidated, almost abandoned. The air was thick with that same uneasy stillness. I hesitated for a moment before walking inside. The fluorescent lights flickered as I stepped through the door, and the familiar ding of the chime echoed in the empty store. The counter was empty. No Mr. Langford. No other employees. Just me, and the endless aisles of old, dusty snacks and flickering lights. "Mr. Langford." I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. No answer. I walked around the store, calling his name a few more times, but the only response was the hum of the old freezer in the back. I was about to leave when I noticed something off. The door to the storage room, it was ajar again. "Do not go into the storage room after 1 a.m. The words echoed in my mind, but it wasn't after 1 a.m. It was broad daylight. I had to know what was inside. I had to know why everything had spiraled out of control since I left this place. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick and musty, a sharp contrast to the rest of the store. Stacks of boxes lined the walls, old supplies and outdated products long forgotten. At first glance, it seemed like just a normal storage room, but as I walked further in, I noticed something odd, a faint light flickering at the far end of the room. Curiosity got the better of me. I moved closer to the light, my heart pounding in my chest. It was coming from an old, beat-up radio, the same kind of radio that sat behind the counter. I reached for it, and as my fingers brushed the dial, the static crackled to life. At first, it was just noise, but then I heard it, the same whispering voice I'd heard that night in my apartment. It was calling my name. And then, all at once, the lights in the room went out. Complete darkness. I spun around, trying to make sense of what was happening, but before I could react, I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned, expecting to see the men in the black coat, but no one was there. Instead, the door to the storage room slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping me inside. My heart raced as I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but there was no one around to hear me. The radio grew louder, the static distorting into something almost human. The voice, now clear as day, spoke again. "You didn't follow the rules." The air around me grew colder, and a deep, suffocating dread washed over me. In the pitch black, I could feel something moving. Something was there, in the darkness, circling me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, its presence, its cold breath, brushing against my skin. I backed up, pressing myself against the door, trying to keep my composure. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the lights flickered back on. The room was empty. The cold, suffocating presence had vanished. I was alone again. Without thinking, I bolted from the storage room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, my heart still racing. I never went back to Midnight Oasis after that. I moved out of my apartment, left town entirely, hoping that whatever it was that had followed me would stay behind. But even now, hundreds of miles away, I sometimes hear the faint sound of footsteps on the roof at night. And every now and then, I find a pack of matches in places where I know I didn't leave them. The rules, it seems, follow you, no matter where you go. And every time I see those matches, I can't help but wonder if I've somehow broken one of them without realizing it. Maybe next time, there won't be a warning.